Alright, so continuing along with our newest stretch of Resident Evil spin-offs we're covering, we've come to the game that I probably knew the least about before putting together this retrospective. Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D. This was yet another outsourced spin-off that came from Capcom's desire to really cash in on the Resident Evil brand while it was at the peak of its popularity. With the recent overwhelming success of Resident Evil 5, Capcom went back to our old friends TOSE and asked them to make yet another licensed spin-off for the series. Those of you who have been keeping up with the retrospective might recall that TOSE actually developed a Resident Evil game in the past, that game being Resident Evil Survivor. This time around though, TOSE would be tasked with turning the series' iconic Mercenaries minigame into a full-blown retail release, one that would be developed for the Nintendo 3DS. So yeah, not exactly the most promising sales pitch of the series so far, but as always, I've ordered myself a copy, sat down to play through the whole thing and really give it a chance, and now have a lot of thoughts on how I feel about this one. So would this little handheld title be able to meaningfully expand the Mercenaries into being worthy of a full standalone release, or would the emphasis on the minigame and the weaker hardware end up holding it back? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 18th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every single Resident Evil game in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but you will have a much better understanding of the series as a whole and my thoughts on each entry if you have seen them. So if you're interested in watching the rest of the retrospective, I'll have the full series playlist linked in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D is a third-person shooter developed by TOSE and published by Capcom for the Nintendo 3DS in 2011. Like I mentioned a minute ago, this game is entirely centered around the Mercenaries minigame that had become a tradition in the mainline Resi titles by this point, but I haven't properly covered or explained the Mercenaries in any of these videos yet, so let's start there just to be thorough. In the Mercenaries, the player's goal is to kill as many enemies as possible in a limited amount of time to earn points and work towards beating their high score before the timer runs out. Every normal enemy will grant the player some points, and every mini-boss enemy killed will obviously grant players more points. Killing multiple enemies in a short amount of time will also result in a combo, giving players massive point bonuses for keeping the pace of combat high for long stretches of time. And even though each session starts with only 2 minutes on the timer, there are a couple of ways to extend your time. Kills with melee attacks will grant the player a few seconds, encouraging them to play riskier and stick close to enemies for more intense combat. And there are larger time bonuses that can be found scattered around the map, with some of these offering as much as 90 seconds of additional time. So overall, it's a very simple minigame, but one that's surprisingly addictive. Bringing things back to the main question of the video though, would TOSE be able to stretch this minigame into being worthy of a full standalone release? Well, at its core, the Mercenaries 3D is basically a port of the RE5 Mercenaries minigame with some maps, characters, and enemies also being included from RE4's Mercenaries mode. If you've played RE5 before, you'll immediately recognize that most of the character animations, weapons, and even the exact loadouts that the characters have here are the same as they were in that game. They've just been downscaled to run on the 3DS hardware. Even the basic controls of the game have been carried over from RE5, with the exception of the inventory management, as the inventory has now just been moved to the bottom screen of the 3DS and is managed through a combination of using the D-pad and the stylus. The game has 8 characters to choose from, with almost all of them coming from, you guessed it, Resident Evil 5. The roster is made up of Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Rebecca Chambers, Claire Redfield, Hunk, Barry Burton, Jack Krauser, and finally, Albert Wesker. 5 of these characters have been pulled from RE5, as Wesker uses his RE5 model, animations, and loadout here instead of those seen in his RE4 Mercenaries appearance. Hunk and Krauser have both been pulled from RE4's Mercenaries mode, and hilariously, I found that these characters had better looking models than any of the rest of them, which I'm assuming is because their models and materials didn't have to be downscaled quite as much due to RE4 being an older GameCube title instead of a newer PS3 title. And finally, Claire Redfield is really the odd one out here, as this is her first ever appearance in a Mercenaries mode. This makes her the only character on the roster who was designed from scratch by TOSE for this game. Each character in the game also has one unlockable costume that you can earn by completing a certain level with a certain minimum rank or higher. These costumes don't change the character's loadout though like they did in RE5, they're purely a cosmetic change, so there are still really only 8 characters in total. And oddly enough, Fan favorite character Leon Kennedy is nowhere to be seen here, despite there being so much Resident Evil 4 content ported over. It felt really odd to me that he was one of the characters that got cut in the process of porting over all the content, and only felt even more so when I played as Claire Redfield for the first time and realized that she had been given Leon's signature Matilda as her handgun. Series producers were asked in Q&As and such back at the time of the game's release why Leon wasn't featured, but we never really got a real answer. They only ever just joked that he wasn't in the Mercenaries 3D because he was too busy with his appearance in the upcoming Operation Raccoon City. Which, yeah, that's definitely one of the reasons of all time. In terms of levels, these have once again just been ported over from RE4 and 5. There are a total of 8 different maps in the game, with 5 of them being brought over from RE5 and the remaining 3 being from RE4. These 8 maps then make up the 30 levels of the game, with each map being used a handful of times across all of them, just with slightly different enemy combinations spawning on them, or incredibly minor changes like being played at nighttime instead of daytime. So overall, we effectively have a full retail release of the Mercenaries mode being made up of a total of 8 characters and 8 maps. Not exactly a great start, but the gameplay has to make up for it, right? Wrong! To start, despite the fact that the controls are basically just pulled straight over from RE5, the considerably lower frame rate of the Mercenaries 3D makes the game feel much less responsive to play, especially because the frame rate isn't totally consistent in this game and tends to dip below its target during intense moments. This is especially noticeable when aiming, as the combat loops of RE4 and 5 were both fairly dependent on you being able to quickly deliver precise shots to specific parts of the body. And speaking of the aiming, you've probably already noticed without me telling you, but while most of the game plays from the familiar over-the-shoulder perspective, aiming at enemies pulls the camera into a first-person view here. This brings players a lot closer to the action, which might sound like a good thing, but it only serves to limit your field of view even further, which then only ends up compounding with the inconsistent frame rate to make aiming feel way more awkward than it did in RE4 or 5. You might have noticed that I've been shooting the legs a lot in my footage here, and that was very intentional because I was seriously having a really hard time hitting the head. Plus, if you're going for melee attacks, most enemies in this game require 2 of them to put down, so you could shoot them in the leg to set up a pretty easy combo where you melee them onto the ground and then do whatever your character's stomp move was. And this next bit will only really affect a very small group of players out there, but if you ever learned the higher level tech in RE5's Mercenaries, like reloading with the inventory or using the iframes from picking up items to avoid attacks, well, you can just forget about all of that because none of it works here. The inventory screen has been completely removed, and the item pickups are instant with no animation now, so everything that made those higher level techniques possible is completely absent here. Like I said, less than 1% of the fandom will have ever even known about these things, but it definitely makes the gameplay feel a lot less interesting when it comes to really pushing for the high scores. Something that I do like though, is that they've added a couple of new variations of the Mercenaries minigame that play around slightly different objectives. Now, when I say a couple, I do literally mean that there are 2 of them here, but they're definitely both worth talking about. Neither of them have an official name for them in-game, but the first of the 2 is one that I really like, with these being what I'm going to call the wave-based levels. These play almost exactly like your typical Mercenaries game, except this time, there are no time bonuses to be found around the map. Instead, if you want to increase your remaining time, you'll have to clear out every single enemy of the current wave, with each wave having more enemies and more difficult enemy combinations than the last. These levels keep the player entirely focused on the combat the entire time, and while it might not be as interesting as the standard Mercenaries mode, it can be a nice change of pace. Unfortunately though, the biggest downside with these missions is that there are only 2 of them in the entire game. So out of the 30 total levels, you only get this little change of pace twice throughout the entire thing, and one of the 2 is the literal only bonus level in the entire game that I didn't manage to unlock during my playthrough. So unfortunately, you've just been looking at footage of the first one this whole time. And to be totally honest with you, I've already sunk close to 10 hours into this game, and I really just don't want to go back and have to play it for another couple hours just to get it. Is it a bit unprofessional of me not to? Yeah. Does that mean I'm gonna do it? No. It's a solid gimmick, but I wish that they used it at least a couple more times throughout the game just to keep things a little more interesting. The other new mission type that they've added here is one where you'll have a full boss fight on top of the normal gameplay loop of juggling the timer and the hordes of enemies that are coming at you. And to complete the level, you'll have to defeat the boss before the timer runs out. Once again, there are only a couple of these in the game, with the first of the two reusing the giant Plagas-infected bat boss from RE5. This boss fight feels a bit out of place here though, as in RE5, it's a boss that can only be damaged in a weak point on its back, and it's very clearly designed with 2 players in mind. Here in the Mercenaries 3D though, you'll have to take him on solo, but he still only has that one weak point on his back. So the only way to get damage in is to use a landmine to knock him down, then blast that weak point during the very short window that you have. This makes it a pretty annoying fight, as on top of doing that, you still have to deal with the other enemies, and of course, if you place a landmine and try to bait the bat boss into it, the other enemies can end up detonating it first and effectively wasting that resource of yours. This, on top of the fact that you have to rush through the fight as fast as possible due to the time limit, just makes it not very fun. And for the second of these levels, we're fighting the bat again on the same map. But this time, the game is also spawning a bunch of the executioners from RE5 on top of the bat. You know, the ones that kill you in one hit. This boss fight wasn't exactly fun the first time they threw it in, and the second time just makes it even more frustrating without really making it any more fun. So in my opinion, these boss fight levels just kind of suck. Now, something that was very cool was the new skill system they added that adds some solid build variety and overall progression to the game. You unlock skills by achieving a minimum rank on certain levels, and once you have a skill, you can equip it to one of your character's 3 skill slots. These skills can do things like increase the amount of health you get for every green herb you use, increase your melee damage, increase the effectiveness of certain weapon classes, and so much more. Once you equip a skill and start using it, you'll gain some experience towards it by completing matches, with each skill having 3 levels to go through. Raising a skill to level 2 will just increase its effectiveness, and raising it to level 3 will make it even more effective, as well as adding in a secondary effect on top of that. For example, the skill that increases the effectiveness of green herbs at level 3 will also restore some of your health every time you kill an enemy with a critical shot. So the skill system offers not only some build variety, but also something to grind for, since you'll likely want to raise every skill to level 3 just to see what they all get to do when they're fully maxed out. It's a really cool addition to the game, and definitely one that made it more enjoyable to play than it otherwise would have been. With that being said though, that's about all there is to really talk about with the Mercenaries 3D. It's a really small game that honestly doesn't do much new or offer a whole lot of content, and that's kind of how I've been left feeling about this game. It's not really noteworthy in any way, it's kind of just there. I could sit here and really rip into it for just being a downgraded version of the RE5 Mercenaries game, but yeah, it's a 3DS game, so of course it is. It's an okay game, but with how little content there is and how underwhelming the gameplay is, it just doesn't feel like it's worthwhile as a full retail release that was originally priced at $40 US. It's not actively bad like some of the other spin-offs we've covered, it's just incredibly dry on content and undoubtedly overpriced. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil The Mercenaries 3D a 5.5. Hey guys, thanks for joining me for this little video on this little game. I know that it was pretty short and unremarkable to be honest, but don't worry because the next video that we've got coming up is covering a really significant Resi title that's actually pretty interesting, so keep an eye out for that one. As always, if you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a subscription, or even share it with a friend who you think would like it. Just anything to really help out and give it a solid boost in the algorithm. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out things like my YouTube memberships or my Patreon to support the channel even further. You can get things like behind the scenes updates on what I'm working on, early video access, and of course, just get to join the amazing group of people who make series like this all possible. With all that being said though, I'm going to get back to work on the next one. So as always, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.